Aria Chambers pressed her thumb against the damp edge of the ledger page until the paper stopped lifting in the wind, then marked 27 crates of haddock in a hand still too elegant for dock accounting, too careful for the life she had chosen. Salt gathered along her cuffs. The boards beneath her boots sweated with tide water. Behind her, the warehouse pulley groaned as another netted load rose from the hold, dripping silver scales and harbour grit into a bucket already stained dark with fish oil. She had been awake since 4, and the day had not yet become light. The ring had left a pale circle on her finger. She noticed it each time she reached for coin or chalk. Her body remembered weight where there was none now, as if the skin itself objected to being released. Yesterday, in the magistrate's receiving room, she had set the polished box on his table and said that she would not proceed. She had not raised her voice. She had not apologized. 2 hours after that, she had signed a neat line in her mother's solicitor's office, surrendering her claim to Lenora Chambers' townhouse, her private sitting room, the pianoforte she had played badly and loved anyway, and the narrow bed where she had learned to sleep without moving. By dusk, she had carried one valise up a warehouse stair that smelled of tar and old rope, and taken possession of a rented cot beneath a slanted roof. The mattress listed to one side. The window would not close all the way. She slept there as if she had always belonged to rough wood and draught. She counted 3 more crates and wrote 30. At the base of the ramp, men shouted over auction rates and unloading order, voices colliding with gull cries and the slap of water against pilings. Blackstone Dock had its own rhythm, impatient and transactional, indifferent to ruin as long as invoices aligned. Aria had thought that indifference might feel like freedom. It did not feel like freedom yet. It felt like standing in open air while still hearing the lock turn. By the 3rd morning after she moved above the salt warehouse, Mr. Pritchard arrived in Lenora's carriage without warning, stepping down in city shoes that recoiled from the mud and lifting his cane as if the dock itself might stain him by proximity. He did not greet her. He looked first at the ledger, then at the crate stacks, then at the coin tin near her elbow. "Miss Chambers," he said, in the tone of a clerk reading freight rates. "Your mother requires family dues, weekly." Aria did not look up from the figures she was totaling. "I no longer reside in her house. Debts do not rely upon residence." He held out a gloved hand. 30% of market receipts, beginning today." She closed the ledger, lifted the tin, and counted the morning's take into his palm. Copper and 2 small silvers, enough to pay for her room and fuel if stretched, enough to buy broth and stale bread, enough to remain 1 step from dependence. He closed his fingers around it as though accepting a dinner invitation. "She also requires your presence at noon," he added. "Townhouse, front entrance." Aria set the lid back on the empty tin. For what purpose? The purpose has not altered. He turned before she answered, climbed into the carriage, and left the dock with his wheels barely avoiding a puddle that would have splashed his door. Aria reopened the ledger and found her own hand shaking. Not visibly, just enough that the pen tip scratched where she wanted a straight line. She placed the pen down, inhaled salt and tar and the iron scent of fresh catches, and steadied herself against the crate stack until the tremor passed. Something harder than tears formed inside her, not dramatic, not noble, simply durable. At noon she walked from Blackstone to Chambers' house in boots, still carrying fish scales on the seams. The butler hesitated when he opened the door and saw the state of her hem. He stepped aside anyway. The hallway smelled of beeswax and rose attar, a cultivated stillness that made the harbour seem like another country. Above the marble console hung her father's portrait, the one Lenora had kept after selling his watch collection, his painted eyes fixed somewhere beyond all of them, permanently unavailable. Lenora waited in the morning room with tea already poured and untouched. She wore grey silk, unadorned except for a sapphire pin at her throat, and held a folded paper she did not pretend to read. Her face had not altered since Arya was 12, and first understood that kindness was not among her mother's domestic habits. Lenora did not rage. She did not plead. She administered. "You are late," she said. "I walked. You could have come in my carriage." "I did not wish to." Lenora set the paper down. "Preference is not relevant. Sit." Arya remained standing. The room was warm, overfed by a coal fire in early autumn. Her own hands were still cold from dock wind. Through the half-open door to the study she could hear pages turning, a man's cough, and the click of a pen against porcelain as someone paused to think. Solicitors again. Always a man in another room converting women's lives into enforceable clauses. Lenora continued in the same bored precision she used when selecting draperies. "You will marry where I direct. Affection is irrelevant." The sentence landed with the force of prior use. Arya had heard versions of it for months, everyone smoother than the last, polished by repetition until it carried no trace of moral uncertainty. This was not anger, this was logistics. "I returned the ring," Arya said. "Yes, you embarrassed a magistrate and inconvenienced a timetable." "I declined an arrangement. You declined solvency." Lenora lifted the paper and tapped it once with a fingernail. "The dock lease has terms. Those terms require capital I do not presently hold in liquid form. Your marriage to Magistrate Howell would have settled that gap. Since you have refused him, you will proceed with Mr. Calthorpe. He is older. He does not require conversation. He requires compliance." Arya looked at the tea service instead of her mother's face. Fine porcelain, gold-rimmed, delicate enough to crack if held too tightly. Her hands wanted to break something, and that, more than anything, told her how narrow the room had become. "I will not." Lenora's expression did not shift. "You mistake posture for power." "I mistake nothing." From the study came a male voice, low and practical. "If the daughter signs, the transfer stands regardless of occupancy." Another replied, "Provided guardianship language remains in force." Arya turned her head toward the sound. The door remained half open, deliberate enough to be accidental. She was meant to hear just enough to understand the mechanism and her place in it. Not a daughter, a signature with eyes. Lenora took a sip of tea she did not want. "Until your marriage is concluded, your earnings are subject to family due. Mr. Pritchard will collect weekly. If you fail to remit, your credit at Barstow Bank will be suspended by petition." "I have already drafted the letter." Arya's pulse beat once, hard at the base of her throat. The bank account was small and mostly inherited from an aunt who had believed in private reserves for women. It was her margin against hunger. Lenora knew exactly what threatening it would do. "You would freeze my account," Arya said. "I would preserve family assets. By stripping mine. By correcting your confusion." Arya met her mother's gaze at last. Lenora's eyes were pale hazel, almost golden in strong light and utterly untroubled. No triumph there, no hatred, only arithmetic. "I'm not confused," Arya said. "Then sign." "No." Lenora set down her cup. "Do not make me repeat myself." Arya drew one breath, then another, and felt her fingers stop shaking. She did not cry. Instead, she reached into her reticule, withdrew the townhouse key she had not returned yesterday in the solicitor's rush, and placed it on the table beside the sugar tongs. "As you wish," she said. 4 words. Quiet as a ledger mark. She turned before Lenora could answer and crossed the hall with dock mud drying on her hem, her boots leaving faint marks on waxed floorboards that a maid would erase within the hour. At the front door, the butler moved as if to speak, thought better of it, and opened the way. Outside, carriage wheels hissed over wet stone. Somewhere behind the closed morning room windows, a teacup touched saucer with a precise click. The walk back to Blackstone took 36 minutes at her pace. She counted them because numbers held when people did not. At the quay, she resumed her place beside the shrimp kettle, skimmed foam from the top with a wire spoon, and priced portions for men who complained about salt while smelling of the sea. By dusk, the sky lowered to pewter. Lanterns came on in a line along the pier, each flame cupped behind warped glass. Mr. Pritchard returned for the evening tally and collected his percentage without comment, then handed her a folded note sealed with her mother's crest. She broke it open after he left. Family obligations remain in force. Present yourself when summoned. Do not presume distance alters authority. No signature. It did not require one. Arya folded the note along the existing crease and slid it into the back of the ledger, where she kept dock permits and supplier slips. Not because it had value, but because records mattered when memory was called unreliable. The kettle hissed. Brine stung a split along her knuckle. She sold the last cup of shrimp to a carter with cracked hands, and watched him count coins twice before parting with them, as if poverty might revise arithmetic by will. Night settled over Blackstone in layers of smoke, salt, and tired voices, and Arya climbed the warehouse stairs to her narrow cot, with her earnings lightened by dues she had not agreed to, and a mother who still reached her through paper, stewards, and law. She lay awake listening to ropes knock against masts below, each hollow strike a reminder that escape and freedom were not the same condition. Then rose before dawn to begin again. Arya rose while the harbour was still a field of black shapes and lantern points, pulled on yesterday's skirt with salt stiff in the hem, and crossed the narrow room by touch so the board near the door would not creak loudly enough to wake the cooper's widow in the next cot. The wash-basin water bit with cold. She pinned her hair with fingers that had learned speed, tucked the ledger and coin tin into her satchel, and descended the warehouse stair into a corridor that smelled of wet rope, herring scales, and coal ash gone damp overnight. Freedom, she had discovered, kept strict hours. At dockside she lit the kettle fire first, then checked the crate line, then marked deliveries in a hand that drew looks from men who expected numbers scratched, not formed. 22 crates of cod, 11 baskets of mackerel. A broken seal on one haddock barrel, noted and initialed before anyone could tell her she had miscounted. The foreman, Mr. Bell, no longer corrected her aloud. He simply grunted and moved to the next complaint. That was progress at Blackstone. Not approval, only reduced interference. The rhythm held because there was no room for anything else. Dawn tally ran until the bell at 7. She sold shrimp from the steam table through noon, when clerks from the river insurers came down in clean cuffs and paid too little while discussing tonnage as if fish arrived in ledgers rather than nets. Afternoon brought weights and spoilage disputes. Evening ended with accounts, her thumb blackened by ink and brine under her nails she could not scrub out. On Sundays she took the back pew at St. Jude's, because no one asked questions there if she came in late and left early, and because the vicar's wife distributed bread crusts afterward to dock labourers' families with a practical efficiency Arya trusted more than sermons. Money narrowed every choice. Her rent for the cot was due every 6 days to Mrs. Dalrymple, who counted coin with spectacles on the tip of her nose and no sentiment in her voice. Fuel, lamp oil, and soap consumed what she had once spent on ribbons without thinking. The dues to Lenora consumed the rest. When Mr. Pritchard arrived each evening, never at the same hour but always before she closed, he stood precisely 1 arm's length from her stall and held out a leather folio as though receiving tax for a crown he had inherited. That evening he appeared while she was wrapping a cup for a stevedore with tar on his cuffs. "Receipt," Arya said, after placing coppers into his glove. He blinked. "This is a family matter." "Then record it as one." The line of customers shifted behind her, impatient with private wars delaying supper. Mr. Pritchard produced a small pad, tore off a slip with performative reluctance, and wrote the amount in cramped script that slanted uphill. She took the slip, blew once to dry the ink, and filed it behind Lenora's unsigned note. Not affection. Documentation. If she could not refuse the extraction yet, she could at least refuse to leave it invisible. At midday the next day she walked 2 streets inland to Barstow Bank, boots leaving crescent marks of dried mud on the tile vestibule. The clerk at the cage recognized her name before her face. His expression altered by degrees from polite blankness to careful discomfort. "Miss Chambers," he said, lowering his voice, "your account remains active. However, there is a petition lodged requesting temporary suspension pending guardianship clarification." "By whom?" He did not answer directly. "No order has been executed." Arya nodded once, signed withdrawal for a modest sum, and accepted the notes without letting her hand tremble. Outside, she stood under the bank awning and counted her breathing until the pulse at her throat settled. Lenora had not yet closed the door. She had only placed a chair against it. That evening, while gulls fought over offal near the pilings, and a boy from the ropeworks played 2 uncertain notes on a penny whistle, over and over until even the gulls seemed offended, Arya portioned shrimp into folded paper cups and watched the same faces pass, as if the pier were a clock face, and each labourer a fixed mark. Old Mr. Kent from Berth 9, who always complained about pepper and always returned. 2 seamstresses from Candle Lane splitting 1 cup between them and counting coins in whispers. A carter with a burn scar on his wrist, who tipped an extra farthing when he thought she was not looking. The dock was rough, but it was legible. Every cruelty had a ledger line. Every kindness had one too, if one bothered to keep proper books. Near closing, when the sky had gone from pewter to ink and the tide slapped harder against the pylons, Mr. Bell paused beside her table. He smelled of pitch and tobacco. "You keep a cleaner tally than my nephew," he said. Arya skimmed foam from the kettle without looking up. "Then your nephew should improve." A corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. "Do not freeze tomorrow's stock. Northerly wind by noon." He walked on before she could answer, already shouting for line handlers. Advice, not courtesy. Still, she adjusted the ice order in her ledger. Survival at Blackstone required hearing what was useful, regardless of tone. That night, the skin at the base of her thumb had cracked from salt and heat, and the room above the warehouse felt less like exile and more like a coordinate on a map she was drawing herself. She ate standing at the window, bread dipped in broth, purchased from the chandler's wife, and watched torchlight swing below as late boats came in. No pianoforte, no footman announcing callers, no one telling her where to sit in her own life. The cost remained steep. The relief remained real. Before the first auction bell the following morning, with mist lying low over the water, she reached the fish tables early enough to see unfamiliar boats tie in on the outer line. One of them was narrow-hulled, paint worn to bare grain along the rail, with nets stacked in stricter order than most crews bothered to maintain. A man stepped down carrying 2 wicker baskets of shrimp and set them beside her stall without asking where to place them. He moved like someone accustomed to heavy work, but not hurried by it, Delivery for Chambers' stall, he said. His voice was low and measured. Not deferential, not challenging. He wore patched wool darkened at the cuffs by spray, and his hands were calloused across the palm, rope burns old enough to have turned silver. His eyes were sea-grey, direct and unreadable. Arya lifted one basket lid, checked freshness by scent and shell colour, then looked at the chalked price on his board and frowned. This rate is wrong. It is the rate. It is 2 pence below morning auction. He gave a slight inclination of his head, as if acknowledging arithmetic rather than argument. Then you have an advantage. I do not purchase under listed floor. Most buyers do. I am not most buyers. For the first time, his mouth altered. Not a smile, only recognition of a pattern matched. Elias Reed, he said, from the Marlin. She tied her apron tighter and met his gaze. Miss Chambers. Miss Chambers, he repeated, formal as a contract, then pushed the baskets fully onto her plank and stepped back to allow space for her first customers. No flourish, no sales pitch, simply a transaction concluded with unusual precision. All morning she sold from his catch and watched margins with suspicion. Even at her ordinary price, she would clear enough to cover rent and coal after dues, perhaps even replace the broken latch on her window before winter. Generosity at docks was rare and usually attached to a hook. She scanned the key for him between customers and found him 3 stalls over mending net twine with quick, disciplined fingers, while speaking to no one unless spoken to first. When addressed, he answered in short sentences and returned to work. At noon, while the bell rang and clerks surged down from Water Street for their bowls, Elias returned with the invoice slate. Arya counted out the agreed amount from her tin, stacked coins into his palm, and noticed he had written a lower total than the baskets warranted. Not accident. Deliberate undercharge by exactly 4 pence. You have omitted part of the weight, she said. He looked at the slate. Have I? You have. She separated 4 pennies from her change, placed them on the wood between them, and slid them toward him. The line of clerks behind her shuffled, muttering about delays. Elias did not pick up the coins. He studied her face as though waiting for a conclusion. She had not spoken. Take them, Arya said quietly. I do not carry favours I did not request. A gull landed on the piling behind him and screamed into the wind. He set down the slate, collected the 4 pennies, then reached into his coat and placed 1 silver half-crown on her table. You gave me silver, she said. I gave you your change. You did not, she counted quickly. He had added 6pence beyond what was due, enough to test whether she would notice in the rush. She felt the old anger rise, not at him specifically, but at every hand that had tried to define her price. She lifted the extra coins and held them out. He did not move. I am not in your debt, Mr. Reed. His eyes remained on hers, steady as tide against stone. Most people keep what is not theirs. The line behind her quieted for a beat, as if the sentence had carried farther than his voice. Arya set the coins into his open hand. Their fingers touched briefly, rough callus against salt-split skin. Then most people are poorly taught, she said. He closed his hand around the money and gave the smallest nod, an acknowledgement that felt less like victory than like notation entered in a private ledger. Then he stepped aside to let the next customer through, and the market resumed its noise around them as if nothing at all had happened. The market resumed its noise around them as if nothing at all had happened, and Arya turned to the waiting clerks with her ladle in hand, measuring portions by habit while the sentence stayed with her like a hook caught in cloth. Most people keep what is not theirs. She had heard men preach virtue over cheap ale and then short-weight widows before dusk. She had heard ladies speak of duty while treating servants as movable furniture. Yet Elias Reed had said it without performance, as if he were naming tide tables. By the time the noon rush thinned, steam had soaked her sleeves and the kettle had burned low. She counted what remained in her tin, separated dues from rent, and closed the lid before Mr. Pritchard could appear and watch her do it. Across the plankway, Elias loaded empty baskets onto his shoulder and began toward the outer berth with the same economical stride he had used all morning. Not hurried, not idle, deliberate. She should have looked away. Instead, she watched him pause beside old Ferrin's stall, bend to retie a frayed mooring line without being asked, and move on before Ferrin finished thanking him. It was a small thing, nearly invisible under the dock's usual clatter. She noticed it anyway. Near dusk, with lanterns still unlit and the sky flattening into a pale iron band above the masts, Arya lifted a splintered crate from behind her table to clear space for the last customers. The bottom board gave a warning crack under the weight. Her boot shifted on wet planks. The crate tipped toward her knee. A hand caught the side and steadied it in one clean movement. "Set it down," Elias said. No raised voice, no alarm, just instruction. She lowered the crate and saw the fault plainly now. A long split running through the center slat where brine had eaten the wood, soft. Another inch, and the whole base would have dropped open across her shin and feet. She stared at the break, then at his hand still braced against the edge, rope calloused and scarred in pale lines that looked older than his patched coat. "I should have checked it first," she said. "You check 20 things first." He straightened the crate, turned it so the good side faced outward, and slid a loose wedge beneath one corner to keep it level. The motion was practiced, familiar. Arya wiped her palm on her apron, aware suddenly of the way her pulse had jumped. "Thank you, Mr. Reed." His eyes were sea-grey in the failing light, clearer now that they were not narrowed against noon glare. Sharp, intelligent. She had thought them unreadable. They were not unreadable. They were careful. "You're welcome, Miss Chambers." He stepped back to give room for a carter reaching across for his parcel. The moment closed in the ordinary way, swallowed by transactions and shouted rates. Still, when Arya bent to skim the kettle one final time, she felt an unfamiliar steadiness settle under her ribs, slight as the weight of a coin, and just as real. Not relief, recognition. Mr. Pritchard arrived after full dark with mudless boots and a folded folio under his arm. He held out his glove. Arya counted the due into it and waited. "Receipt," she said. He wrote with visible annoyance, tore the slip, and handed it over with 2 fingers. As he turned, his shoulder angled toward her stall in the old, calculated way, a reminder disguised as clumsiness. Elias moved between them to lift a coil of net from the piling at exactly the same instant. The steward's sleeve brushed rough hemp instead of Arya's arm. "Mr." Pritchard recoiled as if struck by insult rather than rope fibre. "Mind yourself." Elias did not look at him. "Mind your footing." The steward's mouth tightened. He walked on without replying. Arya filed the receipt behind the others and said nothing. Elias set the coil on his shoulder and continued down plank, not glancing back, as if the path he had chosen had no relation to her at all. It was plausible, it was deniable. It warmed her hands more effectively than the kettle fire. By Thursday of that same week, the dock had folded him into her routine the way a repeated bell becomes part of a street sound. He appeared at first light, with shrimp sorted by size more meticulously than any other boat, gave exact weights, accepted exact coin, and departed without bargaining theatre. At noon he passed again, sometimes with mackerel, sometimes with nothing but a slate and a short question. "How many cups by 10? 32 yesterday," she answered once, still totalling figures. He nodded. "Boil less at first bell, more at second." She looked up then. "You are giving me sales strategy." "I am preventing waste." He said it as flatly as a weather report, but when she adjusted her morning prep the next day, spoilage dropped by nearly half. She did not thank him aloud. She noted the number in her ledger and underlined it once. Repeated proximity taught her details she had not sought. Elias tied net knots faster than any line hand on berth 3, yet he held a quill correctly when he signed invoices. Not clenched like a man unused to writing, but balanced and steady. He spoke little in crowds, though not from shyness. Silence seemed a discipline with him, a way of choosing what mattered. When men tried to bait him into dock gossip, he gave one-sentence replies that ended the matter without offence. And then there were the moments that did not fit his patched coat at all. At the auction railing on Friday morning, a customs runner challenged Mr. Bell over a shipment tagged for delayed offload, waving a stamped paper and demanding immediate clearance fees from the wrong berth. Bell cursed, loud and inventive. The runner cursed back. Crates sat in the sun while both men shouted clauses neither seemed to understand. Elias, carrying 2 baskets past the argument, stopped only long enough to say, "Clause 12 applies to bonded cargo held over one tide. This manifest is local and unbonded. Fee is not due at railing." The runner snapped. "And who are you to interpret the act?" Elias handed Arya her basket, then looked at the man with mild patience. "Read subsection 3. The runner did not read it. He folded his paper, muttered something about confirming at office, and left. Bell stared after him, then at Elias. "You have been reading law at sea, Reed." "Only the parts that cost me money." Bell barked a short laugh and returned to unloading. The dock moved again. Arya stood with the basket against her hip and watched Elias walk away as if he had done no more than comment on tide depth. Men at Blackstone followed instruction only when backed by force, debt, or long-standing loyalty. Yet they had obeyed him in these small disputes with no visible leverage. It did not fit. She let the thought pass because customers were already lining up and curiosity did not pay room rent. Sunday came with bells from St. Jude's carrying over the quay before sunrise. Arya closed her stall at mid-morning, scrubbed her hands as clean as salt-cracked skin allowed, and took her place in the back pew where widows and dock families sat in coats, smelling faintly of fish and coal. She kept her gloves on through the sermon because the split at her knuckle had reopened, a thin sting each time she flexed her fingers. On the church steps afterward, Mrs. Dalrymple's youngest boarder, a girl barely old enough to carry her own pail, dropped half a loaf in a puddle and stared at it as though loss might reverse itself if she did not blink. Arya knelt, exchanged her own wrapped bread for the wet one, and sent the child off with a practical instruction to eat before her broth cooled. She rose to find Elias standing near the lower rail, cap in hand, speaking quietly with the verger about repair to the side gate hinge. Not merely a fisherman, then. A fisherman who volunteered for hinge work at church. He noticed her noticing him and inclined his head. Formal again. "Miss Chambers." "Mr. Reed." The verger, Mr. Hobb, looked between them and said to Arya, "Your supplier has better tools than my carpenter, and greater patience than my nephews." Elias answered before she could. "Your nephews are 12. "Exactly my point," Hobb said, and shuffled off to lock the vestry. A ghost of humour touched Elias's mouth. He offered Arya a small wrapped parcel. "From my aunt's kitchen, vinegar salve for split skin." Arya did not take it immediately. "How did you know?" "You wear gloves indoors." She accepted the parcel, surprised by the gentleness with which he had folded the paper, corners turned in neatly like apothecary wrapping rather than rough dock habit. "Thank you." "It stings first," he said. "Then it heals." No sentiment, no flourish. He replaced his cap and went down the steps toward the quay. Arya watched him cross into the moving crowd of labourers and hawkers until patched wool disappeared among darker coats, then tucked the salve into her reticule beside receipts and bank slips, where she kept all things that might matter later. 3 days passed before Mr. Pritchard returned early, arriving while the noon line still snaked past her stall, and speaking loudly enough for clerks to hear. "Miss Chambers, your mother notes deficiency in Tuesday's remittance." Arya set down the ladle. "Tuesday's remittance matched your signed receipt." "You miscounted." "I did not." He held out his hand, expecting immediate payment to end the scene. Around them the queue quieted in the unpleasant way crowds did when humiliation was offered as entertainment. Arya felt heat rise along her throat, not from shame but from the calculation required. If she paid twice, she lost coal money. If she refused in public, he would carry the refusal home as fresh ammunition. She opened her ledger to the marked page and turned it toward him. "You collected 2 shillings, 4 pence, and wrote this amount in your hand. If you dispute your own figures, you may do so by written notice." "Mr." Pritchard glanced at the page and made no move to read. "Do not instruct me in procedure." Elias arrived at her left with an invoice slate, glanced once at the open ledger and addressed Pritchard with neutral courtesy. "Sir, you are obstructing trade. This is private family business. Not on leased dock space during market hours." The steward drew himself up. "And your authority is what, precisely?" Elias considered him for a beat, expression unchanged. "Sufficient for this request." It should have provoked laughter. It did not. 2 foremen up plank had gone still, watching. Mr. Bell, half turned from a crate line, said nothing at all, which on Blackstone often meant agreement. Pritchard's gaze flicked from Elias to Bell and back, weighing a scene he could not control. He snapped his folio shut. "We will revisit this." "You may submit in writing," Arya said. He left without collecting coin. The line exhaled, voices rising again into ordinary complaints about pepper and portion size. Arya served the next cup, then the next, each movement precise. Elias waited until the queue shortened, slid his slate toward her, and named his weight and price as if no interruption had occurred. She counted payment into his hand. "You did not need to do that." "Yes," he said, "I did." Something in the bluntness of it caught her off guard. She held his gaze a second longer than custom required. Beneath windburn and dock grit, he looked suddenly less like a man drifting berth to berth, and more like one who had chosen his place and expected to keep it. "What did Mr. Bell mean?" she asked quietly, "when he obeyed you yesterday with no question?" Elias tucked the coins away. "Mr. Bell obeys whoever keeps his cargo moving." That is not an answer. It is the only one today. He lifted the baskets and moved off before she could press further. She let him go. Not because she was satisfied, because the kettle hissed over. A clerk was waving for service, and survival still left little room for mysteries. By the end of September, she had stopped being surprised when she found him at the edge of each difficult hour. Near the auction rail when rates turned predatory, by the net sheds when quarrels threatened to spill into damage claims, at the church gate with a hinge pin in one pocket and legal phrasing in the other. He remained Elias Reed in patched wool, a fisherman with sea-grey eyes and short sentences. Yet each day added another small inconsistency to the tally she kept unconsciously now, a separate ledger written behind her ribs. That evening, as she closed the stall and latched the coin tin, Elias paused beside the piling where the tide slapped in slow, regular beats. Lantern light caught the planes of his face and softened the weathered severity she had first taken for distance. "Your left crate hinge is failing again," he said. "I can replace it at dawn." Arya glanced at the hinge and saw he was right. One screw had lifted, the metal plate skewed by repeated weight. "I can pay for repair," she said. "I know." He reached into his coat and held out a small wrapped packet of screws, already counted. She took it. "You prepare for other people's problems as if they were scheduled." "They usually are." For the first time in days, he smiled fully. It transformed his face from guarded to unexpectedly warm, as if a shutter had been opened in a house she had thought unlit. Then the expression was gone, returned to reserve so quickly she wondered whether she had imagined it. She tightened her hand around the packet and said, more softly than she intended, "Good night, Mr. Reed." "Good night, Miss Chambers." He walked toward the outer berths where dark water moved under moored hulls, and men called final counts into the wind. Arya climbed the warehouse stair with salt on her cuffs, receipts in her ledger, and a new, unwelcome certainty settling into place. She had begun to trust a man she did not understand at all. And the knowledge kept her awake long after the dock fell quiet enough for individual sounds to separate. Mast rope tapping wood, a cartwheel complaining on the cobbles below, Mrs. Dalrymple clearing her throat once through the wall. Arya sat on the edge of the cot with Elias's packet of screws open on her knee, 4 small bright heads in her palm, expensive for such ordinary metal. She set them in a row on the windowsill, then folded the paper and tucked it into her ledger between receipt slips and Lenora's unsigned demands. She did not keep gifts, she kept records. At first light she carried the hinge plate and screws down to the stall, tightened the fitting with Mr. Bell's dented screwdriver, and tested the crate lid twice until it closed flush with a clean click. When she looked up, Elias was already at the rail with 2 baskets and damp cuffs, as if he had been there long enough to watch her finish and long enough to pretend he had not. He gave weights. She gave coin. Neither mentioned the hinge. The morning moved on in steam and shouted rates. By noon, an unfamiliar unease had spread through the quay. Not panic yet, but a sharpening in voices and a new caution in the way buyers held handkerchiefs near their mouths when they leaned over fish tables. 2 men from berth 7 argued about river water and sickness. A carter swore that his cousin's warehouse lane had 3 fever cases by Tuesday. At the ropeworks, boys who usually laughed through every chore worked in compressed silence while their overseer sent one of them running for lime. Arya watched faces more than words. Fear had a practical look at Blackstone. Men taking inventory of their own breath. Women wiping stallboards with vinegar that smelled harsher than usual. Everyone calculating how long they could afford to miss a day if a cough deepened into something worse. She set out her cups and kept serving. Near the second bell, a commotion rose at the outer berth, where the Marlin had tied in. Someone shouted for space. Another voice called for water, then for a cart. Arya turned in time to see a young deckhand in his 20s sag against a coil of line, his skin wax pale under dock grime, one trouser leg dark with seeped stain from a gash above the ankle, where an iron hook had torn through cloth. He was breathing too fast, each inhale shallow and noisy. 2 deckhands tried to half-carry him up the plank, cursing their own clumsiness because fear makes hands foolish. Elias came off the boat at once, not running, never running, but moving with a velocity that made room ahead of him. He took the man's shoulders, spoke one sentence Arya could not hear over the crowd, and the deckhand's head lifted fractionally, as if he recognized command more quickly than comfort. They got him to a crate near the water pump. Someone said the fever word again. Someone else stepped back. Arya had customers waiting. The kettle hissed. Mr. Pritchard would arrive at dusk, regardless of plague or storm. Rent came due tomorrow. She knew all of that, and still found herself handing the ladle to Mrs. Kent from berth 9, with the brief instruction, 3 cups only, exact coin, I will return, then untying her apron as she crossed the planks toward the berth. Up close, the deckhand looked drawn and sweat-slick, lashes clumped dark against skin, gone almost grey around the mouth. His boot had been cut away. The wound was dirty but not catastrophic. What frightened her was the heat rolling off him and the tremor in his jaw. "He needs the infirmary," she said. A deckhand answered, defensive because he was afraid. "They turned us away this morning. No credit." Elias glanced at her, sea-grey eyes flat with focus. "Cart is coming." "From where?" "From me." The answer came clipped, practical, and then he was already turning to steady the injured man as another shudder moved through him. Arya looked once toward her stall, saw Mrs. Kent gamely miscounting change while 2 clerks complained, saw the narrow margin of her day beginning to bleed away. She looked back at the deckhand and made a decision with the same motion she used to close a ledger. "I will go ahead," she said. "St. Jude's infirmary keeps broth warm at this hour. If they refuse, they will refuse to my face." Elias's gaze held hers for a beat. "Miss Chambers, you will lose your market." "Then I will lose it." She turned before he could answer and took the side lane at a near run, boots striking wet stone, apron strings trailing from one pocket where she had shoved them without folding. The infirmary sat behind the church wall in 2 low rooms that always smelled of carbolic, boiled cloth, and fear pressed into benches. Sister Agnes, sleeves rolled to the elbow, stood at the entry table with a register and a mouth set in a line that had denied many desperate people since dawn. "No new admissions without deposit," she said, before Arya reached the threshold. "He is a deckhand from Blackstone with a torn leg and fever. We have 6 cots and 9 patients." Arya pulled off her glove, reached into her reticule and drew out the folded banknotes she had withdrawn against winter coal and 2 weeks' rent, the hidden reserve her aunt had told her never to spend for anyone's convenience. The paper felt warm from her body and then, suddenly, very light as she placed it on the table. "Take this." Sister Agnes did not touch it yet. "That is more than a deposit. Then keep accounts and return what remains." The nun looked past Arya toward the lane where wheels now rattled closer and voices rose with strained urgency. "Name of guardian?" Arya swallowed once against the metallic taste that came whenever she committed money she could not replace. "Put it on my account. Treat him first." Only then did Sister Agnes take the notes. She nodded to the orderly. "Cot 3, boil instruments again, fresh bandage roll." What Arya did not see, because she was already lifting the infirmary latch and calling for room at the doorway, was Elias stopping just outside with the cart and hearing every word through the half-open door. He said nothing, but one of his hands tightened on the rail until his knuckles blanched beneath old rope scars. Inside, the next 10 minutes blurred into clean cloth, basin water, and commands spoken at speed. The deckhand, Tommy, someone said his name was Tommy Pike, clutched Arya's sleeve once while they cleaned the wound and tried to pull away from the sting. She stayed until his grip loosened and his breathing eased into a steadier rhythm under a damp cloth at his forehead. When the apothecary arrived with tincture and powders, he read the account name from Sister Agnes's register and gave Arya a measured look that held both curiosity and pity. "You are not family." "No," she said. "Then you are unusual." "I am late for work." She signed the medicine chit in the same careful hand she used for crate tallies, folded the duplicate, and slid it into her reticule beside the now thinner notes. By the time she reached Blackstone again, the second rush had passed. The kettle had boiled low, and Mrs. Kent had gone home with 2 extra coppers. She insisted were not wages, and Arya insisted were. Mr. Pritchard arrived at closing in his usual dryness, held out his glove, and blinked when Arya counted a smaller due than the previous evening. "Deficient," he said. "Accurate," Arya replied. "Reduced sales." He produced his receipt pad with theatrical displeasure and wrote the figure as if each stroke offended him personally. She took the slip, filed it, and did not explain where the missing coin had gone. The doc did not reward explanations. Elias did not approach her stall again that night. She saw him once at the far rail, speaking with Sister Agnes's orderly, then again loading sacks onto the marlin under lantern light. At one point he looked up and found her watching. No smile this time. Only a brief inclination of his head, formal and unreadable, before he turned back to work. 3 days passed before the harbour noise settled into its old cadence and the fever rumours lost some of their edge. Tommy Pike remained at St. Jude's, weak but mending. Arya learned this from Mrs. Dalrymple's boarder, whose aunt scrubbed floors at the infirmary and relayed news in exchange for shrimp shells for soup stock. Arya sent broth twice and did not sign the parcels. On Thursday afternoon, a note arrived at her stall with Lenora's crest pressed hard into the wax, as if pressure could stand in for authority. "Present yourself at once regarding legal correction," it read. Arya stared at the words until the paper stopped trembling in her fingers, then closed her ledger, told Mr. Bell she would return before evening tally, and walked inland without changing her apron. Chambers House smelled unchanged. Beeswax and rose, polished control layered over old wood. The butler admitted her with a glance at her dock-stained hem and directed her towards the rear corridor rather than the morning room. As she passed the study door, she heard voices within and halted because one of them was Lenora's, and the other belonged to Mr. Halbrook, the solicitor who had drafted her last surrender papers. Lenora spoke with that same bored precision Arya had learned to fear more than temper. "Reed is convenient. If she trusts him, she will sign the transfer without reading." Mr. Halbrook answered, pages rustling. "If Miss Chambers refuses?" "She will not. She prefers honesty in men. We shall provide the appearance." Arya's hand went to the door frame. Fingers splayed against carved wood she had dusted as a child, when she still believed labour earned affection. The corridor narrowed around her. She could hear her pulse in her ears, a hard thud that matched the clock in the hall. Halbrook again. "The Pier language must be precise. One mistaken clause and Ashbourne Council will challenge." Lenora gave a soft sound that might have been laughter if she had ever laughed. "Then do not mistake it." Arya stepped back before the floorboard near the threshold could betray her weight, turned without announcement, and left through the side door into a lane washed in late light. The air tasted of coal smoke and distant tide. She walked quickly at first, then faster, then stopped at the corner because her knees had gone unsteady and she refused to be seen bracing against a stranger's wall. Reed is convenient, if she trusts him. She had money missing from her reserve, rent due in one day, a mother still trying to convert her into signature and collateral. And now, this. The man whose measured sentences had steadied the edges of her week, placed in Lenora's strategy like a tool. She did not cry. Her throat ached as if she had swallowed salt water, and her hands felt abruptly cold despite the heat trapped between brick fronts. By the time she reached Blackstone, dusk had begun to lower over the masts. Lamps flickered alive along the pier office row. She moved through the crowd toward her stall. Reticule clutched hard enough that the frame bit her palm. Near the harbour clerk's hut, she heard Elias's voice before she saw him, low and even, carrying just far enough through the half-open window. "Keep her stall in place until quarter's end," he said. "No alterations without my notice." The clerk replied, "As you direct, sir." "Sir." Arya stopped in the shadow of a stacked barrel, every muscle locking at once. The word from Lenora's study and the sentence from the clerk's window struck together like flint. Convenient. Trust. Keep her stall in place. A practical instruction. Perhaps kindness. Perhaps protection. In that moment it sounded like management. Elias stepped out of the hut with ledger papers in hand, work cap low over his brow, patched coat damp at the cuffs. He saw her immediately. For a fraction of a second, something altered in his expression. Not guilt exactly, not surprise exactly. Something tighter, as if an unseen knot had just been pulled. "Miss Chambers," he said. Arya forced her fingers to loosen from the reticule clasp and found that they would not fully obey. "Mr. Reed." He looked at her face, then at the route she had taken from inland streets, then back again. "You are pale. Have you eaten?" The ordinary question, asked in that same controlled tone, nearly undid her because it arrived wrapped in care she no longer knew how to read. Her pulse struck high in her throat. She kept her voice level by effort. "I have work." She moved past him toward her stall. He did not catch her sleeve. He did not block her path. Behind her, the harbour clerk shut his window with a neat wooden click that sounded, to Arya, very much like a lock engaging. She moved past him toward the stall and kept moving until the kettle stood between her and the clerk's window, until steam struck her face and gave her a reason for the heat in her eyes. Her hands worked by memory. Ladle, fold, coin, change, next. She did not look toward the harbour office again. She did not look for patched wool at the edge of the crowd. The dock noise returned around her in hard, practical layers. Buyers arguing weight, gulls descending on discarded shells, a winch chain shrieking against rust, and each sound seemed cleaner than language. Language had become a trap door. When Mr. Pritchard arrived at full dark and held out his glove without preface, she counted his share into it and asked for a receipt in the same even tone she had used yesterday and the day before. And every day Lenora had tried to turn extortion into routine. He gave the slip with visible annoyance. She dried the ink with one breath and slid it into her ledger. He lingered, expecting resistance, apology, perhaps explanation for her fixed expression. She gave him none. Up the warehouse stair she lit her lamp, shut the door, and pulled her valise from beneath the cot without pausing to ask herself where she would sleep tomorrow. She packed by category, not sentiment. 2 shirts, 1 wool dress, stockings wrapped in paper. Ledger first, then receipt slips, then Lenora's unsigned notes, then the bank clerk's warning about guardianship petition, then the medicine chit from St. Jude's with her signature and account name clear. Last came the folded paper from the harbour office that had granted her temporary stall placement, stamped but not sealed. She had kept it because she kept everything. Tonight, the habit became a weapon. At the bottom of the valise, she placed the magistrate's returned ring box, empty except for the indent in velvet, where commitment had been displayed as collateral. Not memory, evidence of pattern. She tied the straps tight, wrote 3 lines to Mrs. Dalrymple on a scrap of invoice paper. "I surrender the cot at dawn. You may keep the deposit against remaining week. Thank you for clean sheets," and weighted it with the room key on the washstand. The cost landed in her chest a beat later, blunt and physical. Cot forfeited, deposit gone. No margin left. By first bell the next morning she had already crossed to St. Jude's and stood at the infirmary desk while Sister Agnes recapped medicine bottles for the morning rounds. The nun looked at her valise, then at her face, and understood enough not to ask soft questions. "I require a copy of the account entry for Thomas Pike," Arya said. Sister Agnes wiped her hands, opened the register, and traced down the page. For what purpose? For legal submission. Against whom? For myself. The nun's eyes narrowed briefly, not in suspicion, but in appraisal. "You paid in full yesterday. The apothecary returned 1 shilling, 6. I held it for you." Arya accepted the coins and the copied page, signed by Sister Agnes and witnessed by the orderly. External debt closed, record secured. On the church steps she met Mr. Hobb, carrying a box of hinge pins, and asked, in a single sentence, whether he would deliver a note to Mr. Bell at Blackstone. He agreed with a nod and no curiosity. The note was short. "Bring Harbourstall register copy to Admiralty Clerk by 9th bell, if he values his own tally." She signed it with her full name. At Barstow Bank, she waited through 2 gentlemen arguing investment rates before the same cage clerk approached with his careful discomfort. She placed her passbook and guardianship notice on the counter. "I need certified copies of all petitions lodged on my account," she said. "Now." He hesitated. "Miss Chambers, these requests are ordinarily made by family solicitor." "I am the account holder." His gaze dropped to her valise, to the dock mud still dried at her hem, then back to her face. Whatever he saw there ended the delay. He produced the ledgers, copied entries with formal notation, affixed the bank stamp, and slid the pages through the opening with unusual precision. "There is one additional filing from yesterday," he said quietly. "A request to place temporary administrative hold pending transfer review." "By whom?" He did not answer directly, but this time he did not need to. He tapped the signature line once, "Halbrook and Finch," on behalf of Lenora Chambers. Arya paid for copies from the coins Sister Agnes had returned and left with less money than she had entered, but with proof no one could call anecdote. The Admiralty hearing room smelled of damp wool, sealing wax, and impatience. Men in dark coats stood in clusters near the windows, while clerks moved bundles of tied papers from one long table to another. At the far end, beneath the royal crest, carved above the bench, sat Magistrate Howell, her former intended, straight-backed and professionally blank, his eyes carefully avoiding her until protocol forced acknowledgement. Lenora stood 2 paces behind her solicitor in pearl grey, gloved hands folded at her waist, as if waiting for a musical to begin. She did not turn when Arya entered unannounced. She knew that footfall. "Miss Chambers is not listed for appearance," Mr. Holbrook said before anyone asked, irritation sharpened by surprise. "This matter concerns lease correction and debt instruments." Arya set the valise on the nearest table, opened the clasps, and began removing papers in neat stacks. "This matter concerns coercion by fraudulent family claim and attempted transfer without informed consent." Howell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Chambers, procedure requires counsel. Procedure also requires authentic signatures and lawful guardianship language. I have brought records." Lenora turned then. Her eyes were pale and undisturbed, arithmetic made flesh. "You are making a scene." Arya met her gaze and placed the first stack before the clerk. "I am making a record." She submitted in order, weekly receipt slips signed by Pritchard, Lenora's unsigned directives demanding dues, bank petitions seeking account suspension. St. Jude's account copy proving independent payment during period, claimed as insolvency. Stall permit copy showing Aria as operating party. And last, the empty ring box, which she set beside Howell's blotter without comment until his expression altered by a degree. Mr. Halbrook recovered first. These items are irrelevant to present lease correction. Aria's voice did not rise. Then read your own filing aloud. Clause 7 binds my marriage status to doc collateral value. Clause 9 authorizes family representative signature where female beneficiary is under domestic supervision. I am 26. I reside independently. You sought to classify me as supervised property. Silence moved across the room in a visible wave. One clerk stopped writing mid-line. Near the side door, Mr. Bell arrived breathless with harbour register pages in his large hands and passed them to the Admiralty clerk without speaking. He took position at the wall, cap twisting once in his grip, and went still. Howell lifted the filed petition, read 2 sections, then addressed Halbrook with judicial neutrality that did not conceal strain. Is this language yours? It is standard protective phrasing. For minors and incapacitated persons, perhaps. For unmarried daughters in debt-linked estates? Aria cut in before he could complete the sentence. I was never in debt. My mother was. Lenora's voice entered for the first time, cool and flat. Your distinction is sentimental. Households are singular entities. Not under law, Howell said, still looking at the page. He turned to Aria. Miss Chambers, can you attest under oath that weekly remittances were extracted under threat of credit suspension? I can attest. I can also produce bank clerk testimony. The clerk from Barstow, whom she had asked to attend if subpoena followed, now stood in the back row with hat in hand, startled to find himself needed so quickly. Howell noted him, nodded once, and motioned for the statement. External contact answered. Halbrook shifted strategy. Even if dues collection was inelegant, transfer authority remains with leaseholder representation, and the Pier proprietor has raised no objection. The door at the rear opened before the final word settled. Conversations did not stop dramatically. They narrowed, then thinned. A man entered in formal naval black, cut close through the shoulders, coat buttons carrying the Ashbourne crest in dull silver. No patched wool. No work cap. Elias crossed the room with the same economical stride he used on wet planks, then removed his gloves and set one document on the bench. His eyes were sea grey and no longer careful. They were clear. I am Elias Ashbourne, proprietor of the Ashbourne Fleet and legal holder of Blackstone Pier, he said, voice low enough that everyone leaned to hear. And no transfer touching Miss Chambers is valid. The sentence altered the geometry of the room. Halbrook's papers slipped a fraction in his hand. Lenora's stillness broke at last in a single blink, then another, as if she were recalculating from first principles and finding no stable number. Mr. Bell stared at Elias, then looked down at his own boots with a short, private exhale that might have been vindication or relief. The Barstow clerk straightened his collar, suddenly eager to be aligned with accuracy. Aria did not move. Her fingers remained on the edge of the valise where she had braced them when Halbrook spoke over her, and she became aware with startling clarity of every prior inconsistency aligning in one clean line. The legal clauses named from memory, the foreman obeying without challenge, the harbour clerk's, "As you direct, sir," the disciplined refusal to take what was not his because he had never needed to steal leverage he already possessed. Howell accepted Elias's document, scanned the seal, and addressed the room in clipped formal cadence. Recorded title confirmed. Pending instruments invoking Miss Chambers's guardianship status are suspended for immediate review. No enforcement actions will proceed today. Lenora spoke without looking at Arya. This is procedural delay, not judgment. Arya closed the valise and fastened both clasps. It is enough. She said it quietly. 4 words would have sufficed, but this was the line she chose. Sufficient for one morning. For the first time, she could breathe without permission. Enough to stand in a room where she had been entered as collateral and leave as a party on record. When she turned toward the side aisle, Elias stepped back to clear her path, not touching her sleeve, not claiming the moment. Formality remained between them like a narrow bridge neither crossed in public. Yet when she passed, he said her name once, without title, and the single, unguarded note in it carried farther than any declaration. Arya. She did not look back at Lenora. She did not look at Howell or Halbrook, or the gathered clerks now shuffling papers into new, less convenient order. She walked out of the Admiralty chamber with one bag in her hand, her cot surrendered, her savings reduced, and her name entered where it could no longer be erased by someone else's signature. The corridor outside the hearing chamber smelled of wet wool and sealing wax, and Arya stopped beside a narrow window because her knees had turned uncertain in the space between one breath and the next. She set the valise down, pressed her fingertips to the sill, and watched 2 river barges slide past each other below the embankment road, both moving forward as if law and ruin were merely weather. Footsteps approached, measured and unmistakable now that she had heard them on stone as well as planks. Elias halted at a courteous distance. "Miss Chambers," he said first, formal enough for any passing clerk, then lowered his voice. "Arya, I owe you the truth in full." She kept her eyes on the river for another beat before turning. In naval black, he looked like the man the doc had obeyed all along, not altered so much as correctly named. The same sea-grey eyes, the same restraint. "You owed it earlier," she said. "Yes." No defense followed, no attempt to soften the fact. She lifted the valise. "Then begin with this. When you told the harbour clerk to keep my stall in place, was it protection or management?" "Protection," he answered. "Without your consent to transfer, without your signature, without any condition attached. I set quarter's end because Lenora's solicitor was preparing an interim reassignment petition. I intended to block it before it reached filing. You did not tell me." "I did not." His jaw tightened once. "You had been deprived of decisions by everyone around you. I chose concealment to preserve leverage. It still cost you trust." The clarity of it made anger harder to hold in the same shape. Harder, not gone. A clerk passed them carrying tied dockets and gave Elias a look that carried recognition, caution, and a question he did not ask. Elias stepped back to let Arya take the corridor first. "Come to the Pier office at noon," he said. "The Admiralty order will be entered there. Your license must be issued in person." Arya studied him a moment longer. "I will come." When she reached Blackstone, the market had already lifted into full noise. Mrs. Kent, aproned and indignant, was serving from Arya's kettle as though born to command lines, and Mr. Bell stood beside the stall, fending off complaints with the flat authority of a man who had hauled nets since boyhood. "You are late," he said when Arya came within earshot. "I was at Admiralty." "I gathered." He nodded towards the coin tin. "Your queue thinks they own your time." Arya took the ladle from Mrs. Kent, thanked her with 2 wrapped portions for her trouble, and worked through the line until the last clerk had gone. Only then did Bell place a folded paper on the plank. Admiralty interim order, stamped and drying. He cleared his throat. "For record, Miss Chambers, berth foremen were notified this morning that no dues collector is to interfere with your trade. For record, Arya said, thank you for bringing the register. Bell's cap turned once in his hands, echoing the nervous movement from the hearing room. I ought to say this plain. I knew Reed was Ashbourne by spring thaw. Not title in detail, but enough. He told me if I spoke, your affairs would worsen before they improved. And you agreed. I agreed because I have seen rich men assist women straight into dependence. He did not touch your ledger, your pricing, or your stock decisions. He asked only for sightlines and timing. Bell looked toward the outer berth, where the Marlin sat tied in ordinary paint beside costlier hulls. I judged him by that. It was not an apology, it was a disclosure, overdue and useful. Before she could answer, Pritchard appeared at the edge of the plank in city shoes and stale certainty, leather folio already in hand. He held out his glove by habit. Arya did not reach for the tin. She slid the Admiralty order across the counter. Family dues are terminated under review, she said. Any further attempt at collection will be entered as harassment on leased commercial space. Pritchard read the first lines, colour draining by degrees from his face. This is temporary. It is enforceable. He looked over her shoulder, perhaps seeking an ally in the crowd. He found none. Even the men who disliked her prices enjoyed watching power redirected. He folded the paper with exaggerated care and returned it. This is not concluded, he said. It is concluded enough. He turned and left without coin. At noon, a week and 3 days after she had first asked him for written receipts, Arya crossed the threshold of Blackstone Pier office, through the front door where clerks had once made her wait in the rain. The room was high-windowed and cold, despite the stove, lined with ledgers thick as paving stones. Harbour Clerk Denby rose when she entered, dipped his head and placed 2 documents on the desk blotter, operating licence and birth tenancy certificate, both pre-written in a hand she recognised as his, both awaiting her signature alone. Miss Chambers, he said, no smirk now, no delay. By directive of proprietor and Admiralty acknowledgement, your shrimp and fish concession is entered under your sole authority, quarterly renewable, fees paid through Michaelmas. Arya read every line. She read the margins. She read the tiny rider at the bottom that barred transfer by proxy. Only then did she sign. Denby sanded the ink, shook off the excess, and pushed 1 copy toward her. For your records. She slipped it into her ledger beside bank copies, infirmary chit, Lenora's notes, and receipt slips that had begun as proof of harm and ended as proof of pattern. The full chain sat in her hands, complete. A knock sounded at the door behind her. Lenora entered in pearl grey as if summoned to hostess's calls rather than denied at law. Mr. Halbrook 1 pace behind with a case of papers and a face set to endurance. Denby remained standing but did not offer chairs. We are here regarding revenue restoration, Halbrook began. Denby lifted the Admiralty order from his desk and spoke with clerkly finality. Revenue Authority has shifted pending fraud inquiry. Existing collections are frozen. Petition for restoration may be filed in writing after review. Lenora's gaze passed over Arya and settled on Denby, as if daughters were ambient furniture. You will process my request now. I will not. The refusal, plain and bureaucratic, landed harder than shouted defiance. Lenora's nostrils flared once. She turned to Arya at last. You have made yourself very public. Arya held her mother's eyes and did not lower hers. You made me paperwork. Public was the only language left. For the first time, Lenora's expression showed strain, thin and quickly masked. You are still my daughter. Not your collateral. Lenora said Arya's name like it tasted of iron and turned toward the door before any further sentence could diminish her. Halbrook followed with his case clutched to his chest. At the threshold he glanced back, opened his mouth as if to offer procedural warning, then thought better of it and left. The loaded pause resolved into silence. He never did reveal whether he had doubted Lenora's clauses from the start. Before Arya could move, a court runner arrived with a sealed Admiralty minute. Denby broke the wax, read once, then read aloud for record. Magistrate Howell's final order had been entered after review. Every coercive instrument tying Arya Chambers to guardianship status or marriage-directed transfer was void ab initio and permanently unenforceable. The restoration petition submitted through Halbrook and Finch was denied and dismissed with prejudice. Barstow Bank was directed to lift administrative holds and recognise only Arya Chambers' authority over her accounts. Any proxy attempt to collect dues or direct her marital disposition was barred as unlawful interference. Denby copied the order number into the birth ledger, then met Arya's eyes. This one is final. Business complete, she stepped out onto the Pier office landing with her new certificate under her arm. The afternoon light lay bright on wet boards, and men moved around her without the old, dismissive shoulder turns. A rope boy touched 2 fingers to his cap. Mrs. Kent called from her stall, "Mistress Chambers now, is it?" with dry amusement, and Arya answered, "Arya will do." While feeling deep and quiet, the return of her own name to her own use. By dusk she had closed early for the first time in months, carried her ledgers upstairs, and counted coin without subtracting dues. Rent was still due, winter still coming, labour still hard. Yet numbers now obeyed only arithmetic. A soft knock came at her door as she latched the tin. Elias stood in the corridor, bareheaded, coat unbuttoned at the throat as if rank had become less useful in this narrow space. In his hand he held the room key she had left for Mrs. Dalrymple. "She asked me to return this," he said. "She said your note surrendered the cot in haste and that haste is poor real estate judgment." Arya looked from the key to his face. "I forfeited it." She refused forfeiture. A small pause. "I paid nothing." She took no instruction. She said, and I quote, "The girl needs sleep more than pride." A breath of laughter almost escaped her, the first in days. "That sounds like Mrs. Dalrymple." Elias extended the key. She took it, their fingers touching briefly, less accidental than before. He remained at the threshold, not presuming entry. "There is one more matter. The funds you paid for Thomas Pike's care were reimbursed this afternoon from Fleet Injury Reserve. Denby placed the amount in your account at Barstow under your own signature authority. Sister Agnes insisted upon witness." Arya stared. "Tommy lives?" "He sat up at noon and demanded salted eels. The surgeon refused. He argued with remarkable energy." She closed her eyes a moment, relief moving through her like warmth returned to frozen hands. "Good." When she looked up again, Elias had not moved. The corridor lantern caught the old rope scars across his knuckles, the same hands that had mended nets and signed title orders. "I watched you for weeks before introducing myself," he said. "Not to trap you, to verify what kind of person Lenora intended to break. I thought distance was discipline. Then you paid for a deckhand with money you could not spare, and distance ceased to be honest." Arya leaned one shoulder against the doorframe, suddenly tired enough to tell the truth without ornament. "I heard you at the clerk's window and believed the worst, because the worst had been efficient all my life. You were reasonable to do so. I do not require perfection, Mr. Ashbourne." She let the title sit between them, then set it down. "I require plain dealing." His expression shifted, gentled by something unguarded. Then plain dealing. I would like to court you, if you permit it, with no contracts hidden in ledgers and no decisions made over your head. Outside, the tide struck the pilings in patient intervals. Down on the quay, someone laughed, someone cursed a tangled line, someone shut a crate with a clean metal click. Life continuing, not pausing for declarations. Arya considered him in the doorway of the room she had nearly abandoned, above the dock where she had been reduced and restored. He had opened doors without claiming to save her. He had concealed himself and then stepped fully into consequence when it mattered. The balance was not simple. It was true. "Will you remain," he asked quietly, "at Blackstone in your place, and allow me to stand beside you when invited?" She held his gaze and felt the answer settle with the steadiness of ink drying on signed paper. "I will remain."